wonderful to hear you all having such great conversations. I know we have a lot of guests here today, and we welcome you. I'm Beth Wolf. I'm Director of Continuing Education for the university. And I just want to welcome all of our members. And if you're not a member, I hope today gets you hooked and wanting to join our lifelong learning program. This is our Tuesday talk for April. And we will actually have a bonus Tuesday talk this month. So in 2 weeks, Heather Smith will be here to talk about healthy eating and exercise. And so, if you need it or you don't, whatever. We also have this month a 3-week class on the music of Duke Ellington. It starts this Thursday. It will meet from 2 to 3 p.m. This Thursday, next Thursday, and the following Thursday on Marshall's campus in the Jomi Jazz Center, and that is attached to the Joan C. Edwards Playhouse. And there's a parking garage right next to it. So you can park in the garage, just walk right around. You don't have to cross the street or anything. That class is $30 for members, $60 for non-members. And you can sign up today. You can sign up on site. If you want to wait till Thursday, you can sign up at the start of that class. And then also next Friday, we're doing our day trip to the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. We have about 9 seats left in the vehicle. So if you haven't signed up for that and would like to, those are available until they're gone. And that is $95 for members, $150 for non-members, and that includes your transportation, your admission to the asylum, and lunch in Weston, and I promise we'll bring you back. So, it's round trip transportation, not one way. Okay. But today we are very excited to have Dr. Kevin Law. He's on faculty at Marshall University, and he is going to be talking to us about monster storms and some historic storms in our area. And I know this is a topic that several people had requested that we have a speaker for, so we were so grateful to him when I sent that email and said, would you come give a talk? And he said yes. I was very excited, so we appreciate his time in being here. And so without further ado, I will turn it over. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for having me here this morning. I'd much rather talk about weather than healthy food and exercise. But I've been a professor here at Marshall for 13 years, and I've been the state climatologist for West Virginia for 10 years. And if you don't know what a state climatologist is, I mean, it's really kind of hard to describe. I'm not paid for it. It's a strictly volunteer position, more of a title than anything. But I do field questions from the media whenever there's a big storm in the area. I get questions from attorneys in court cases. I have been asked to testify a few times in court, things like that. So it is important, I guess, in that regard, but it's really a fun job. It's an interesting job. The weather always changes, and it keeps me on my toes, and I really enjoy it. So what I had in mind here today was to talk about some of the monster storms that we've had here in our tri-state area over the years. And when you get really down to it, West Virginia, Ohio, Kentucky were really affected more than anything else by flooding, heavy rains and so forth. So we'll talk quite a bit about floods in over the years. And also we have a tendency to have some winter storms on occasion, although this past winter we haven't had anything really to speak of. But believe it or not, this is still not one of the top 10 least snowy winters. We've actually had milder winters than we've had this past winter. So I'll have a little top 10 list to kind of show you there. Yeah. And we do have a few high wind storms to speak of as well. So we'll kind of break it down to these 3 major categories here today. So I've broken it down with the floods, winter storms, and high winds. And I'm sure you can probably even think of maybe a few other storms to maybe add to my list, but I've tried to think of some of the more famous or infamous storms that have impacted our region. So when you look at some of the major floods that have impacted the tri-state, you have to talk about the 1913 Ohio River flood, and especially the 1937 Ohio River flood, especially here in Huntington. We'll also have to talk a little bit about the 1985 West Virginia flood that came about from some remnants of some tropical moisture late in November there. And then just more recently, we have the 2016 West Virginia flood that hit the Greenbrier Valley. Some really nasty flooding occurred there. Then we'll change gears a little bit and look at some winter storms. And really the most infamous storm here in the state, really, or the storm of the century if you want to put it that way, would have been the 1950 Great Appalachian Storm. Then we'll have to talk a little bit about the 1993 March Superstorm, which was also kind of called the storm of the century too. And then the 1996 January snowstorm that we had, which was pretty close to the 93 storm. We really haven't had what you'd say a true classic snowstorm in really in the 2000s, although we had one in 2016 that was pretty bad. But they really kind of pale in comparison to what we had back in the 90s and definitely back in 1950. And then a couple of the high wind events that I selected, at least here in the tri-state, would have been the F5 tornado that hit Wheelersburg there in 1968. And then we can't forget about the 2012 derecho event that caused havoc here in the region. So to get things started, I'm just going to give you some basic stats, what it was like during some of these events, and then I have some small short clips that I've selected off of YouTube to kind of give you some more information about what happened during each of these events, and they have some good photos there as well. But the 1913 Ohio River flood was really the second major flood that hit the Ohio River. There was another one back in 1884, but this was a really bad flood that really impacted the state of Ohio. It was a mid-March flood, and really you get some of the worst flooding in March. The reason why is because the soils tend to be really saturated. You oftentimes have snowpack in certain areas, and then you also have warmer temperatures that come into play, and you get heavy rains on top of those saturated soils. So when you look back in history, a lot of our major floods have occurred in March. So 1913, it was a mid-March, there was a mid-March snow ice storm that impacted a lot of Ohio there. And can you imagine up to 11 inches of rain that fell in about a 48-hour period? So when you combine that, on top of that snow cover, you're going to have some major flooding. Here in Huntington, we had the second highest ever recorded crest, and it's about 66.4 feet. That was behind, of course, the 1937 flood, which was just a little bit higher than that. Now, whenever you look at the entire region, there were an estimated 650 deaths, especially in Ohio and 10 other selected states, and it was the second deadliest flood behind the great Johnstown flood up in Pennsylvania that killed 2,000 people. But I know you can't see this very well in the back, but these purple areas are just showing you where the heavy rains were. So most of the heavy rains were up in Ohio and Indiana, but even here in Huntington, we had a pretty moderate amount of heavy rain there. So, do this. I'm just going to show you a little bit of this clip. Get this. If this will play. This is from the USGS of the 1913 flood. So a lot of pictures that you're going to see on this video. Video or audio. But this would have been largely up in Columbus. And all the way down into Portsmouth. 8 to 11 inches of rain. So yes, that was a very deadly flood, and then we go a couple of decades later to the year 1937. But this flood in 1937 happened to be a January flood, and that winter actually started off to be a pretty warm winter. And because of that, the air has a lot more capability of holding moisture, and you get a lot more potential for rainfall. So the temperatures were actually very comfortable. However, we had a lot of rain, and we had a lot of rain during the month of January. So 12 inches of rain in January. Now, to kind of put that in perspective, you usually get maybe about 3 to 4 inches of precipitation during a month. That's about it. We're talking 12 inches of rain. And again, the ground is typically saturated during that time of the year, so it really has nowhere to go but to run off. So it produced the heaviest, or I should say the largest crest there on the Ohio River to this day, at 69.45 feet. And the flood stage here in Huntington is at 50 feet. So we're almost 20 feet above flood stage. And there's some really good pictures. If you go to like the Morrow Library, you can get all sorts of pictures of what the Ohio River flood was like there in downtown Huntington. And it's just amazing when I go there on campus and you see pictures of where it was in relationship to today. It was basically almost up to the stoplights there on 3rd Avenue. And you just look and it's like, man, I cannot imagine the water being this high downtown. But 385 people were killed, not here, but at least in the entire region, because it was all the way from Pittsburgh all the way down to Cairo, Illinois, that whole Ohio River basin. And if you were to adjust that monetary damage to 2019 numbers, it'd be about $8.7 billion worth of damage. So it was definitely one for the record books, and still stands to this day. And this is just going to be a short snippet here of
I'm meteorologist Mark Mancuso, and
Weather
weather
and
history.
history.
Between late January and February 1937, a great flood impacted the Ohio River Valley. Starting on January 5th, the Ohio River levels began to rise in Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana, and Illinois. On the 10th, a winter storm held in the region, snow, sleet, and heavy rains. Over the next 2 weeks, the river quickly overflowed its banks. 1 million people were left homeless. Damage stretched from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania to Cairo, Illinois. River gauge levels reached 80 feet in Cincinnati, the highest in the city's history. Martial law was declared in Evansville, Indiana, as the water level reached 54 feet. For weeks, many radio stations broadcast nonstop commercial-free news coverage. The airways were used to relay messages to rescue crews, as it was their only means of communication. Water levels receded on February 5th. Almost 400 were killed, and property damage totaled to $500 million. The scale and speed of the flood was so unprecedented that a comprehensive plan for flood control was implemented. 70 storage reservoirs were created to reduce flood heights along the Ohio. Flood damages have drastically reduced since its completion in the 1940s. I'm Mark Mancuso.
Yeah, so after that major flood, we have now a lot of flood control dams and so forth there on the river that has helped prevented anything being remotely that close since. So yeah, 69 feet, almost 70 feet. That's just amazing to stop and think about. Unreal. So when we go a little bit further here into the future here, let's go to the 1985 West Virginia flood. Now, although this flood really didn't impact Huntington so much, it sure impacted a lot of other parts of the state. It's very memorable for folks up in the more mountainous regions of the state. If you were to go up toward Marlington or up in Pocahontas County or up toward Elkins or Canaan Valley, Tucker County, up in that part of the state, that particular flood is probably the standard bearer, kind of the gold medal winner in terms of all-time record flooding. So a lot of those records still stand to this day. But it was a November flood, and it basically came about from a tropical system So a hurricane that made landfall along the Gulf Coast. And that hurricane made landfall and then started to move north, and it went north into Canada. And without getting into all the fancy meteorology and so forth, it allowed another secondary low pressure system that developed on the backside, and it kind of stalled out. And where it stalled out was near the West Virginia mountains. And you had enormous amounts of rain falling in an area that really can't deal with a lot of rainfall. You have rains, about 5 inches of rain, and you think, well, maybe that doesn't really sound like that much, especially when we were talking about 12 inches in an area like Huntington, but you put 5 inches of rain in a mountainous region, it just runs off really quickly. And it had nowhere to go, and all of a sudden the rivers rose really, really quickly. And as you see the picture, this is probably one of the more infamous pictures from the 1985 flood. That is a cow stuck underneath the bridge. Yeah, so that picture was taken from the West Virginia Archive, State Archive there. So, but it just shows you how quickly the water rose. You'll hear people talk about it was from a hurricane. It's kind of a yes or no kind of answer there. The hurricane itself wasn't directly responsible for the flooding, but the moisture from that hurricane was kind of left on the backside, and then that secondary low took over, and that's what caused the enormous amounts of rain there. So it's kind of a two-pronged kind of answer there. 47 people were killed, and it's one of the deadliest floods in West Virginia history. I have a short video clip. This is actually from the Charleston Gazette that kind of rehashes some of the information from that particular flood back in 1985. Play there.
We were sort of a day late going to the floods. It happened, the newspaper was a little slow in responding. I think most of the press was at that time. It was sort of all hands on deck. Everybody grabbed a reporter, photographer, and left. And it was just total devastation, flooding throughout the town, mud everywhere, all throughout the buildings. I can remember coming to roads that ended. The road was washed away. So we'd have to stop, turn around, and go back. I think people were in shock. I remember photographing a lady who they rescued, and she was holding onto her cat. A lot of animals were probably washed away, as well as people.
I remember getting sent out right away with Governor Moore in the state helicopter. And I think there was a TV cameraman along and a couple other state officials, maybe the state police superintendent or something. So we flew north up through the clouds. I just remember being enveloped in clouds and heading to Parsons, where I guess the reported some of the greatest damage was at. We could see at one point, and I remember just looking at some pictures not long ago, where the river had come through and just knocked out like 9 houses, I think, right in a row. And you could see, all you could see were the foundations that were left.
I talked to, of course, along the Greenbrier River then as now, there's a lot of vacation camps and fishing camps, and so people have travel trailers and small cabins and things like that, and a lot of those got washed away. I talked to, I remember one couple from Raleigh County who said they came up to see if their vacation camp was okay, and got there just in time to watch the trailer being carried away in floodwaters.
But the night the flood actually started, we were getting reports that there might be flooding around Weston and Clarksburg, and we weren't really expecting anything major anywhere else, certainly nothing of the dimensions that ended up happening. And So when I started making calls the following day, Tuesday I think it was, we began to get a sense of how extensive and deadly the flood was, especially in places like Franklin and Parsons and up in the mountains there. It's one of the problems about working in Charleston. Sometimes it can be, the weather can be quite different 100 miles away. Back in the days before social media and the internet, it was really hard to keep track of things on a kind of a solid state basis.
There was a couple in Riverton that had a gas station, a little Exxon gas station, and it was just devastated. And they were in their 70s, and they just sat there in front of their station. I don't think they knew what to do. I remember passing, and there's a little town called Lungo, and it's before you get to Seneca Rocks. There's a beautiful little white church there. I think it's a Mennonite church. And the women were there. Everything in that church had, water had gotten into the church, into the hymnals and everything. And they had all the seats outside. They had all the hymnals outside. They were trying to save everything, try to dry things out, basically. I just remember those ladies just sort of being devastated by it.
We had to phone in stories back in those days and dictate what we'd come across, and so I had to write things down in longhand on a yellow legal pad and dictate it to someone back in Charleston. And Chris had to develop his film in the bathroom and use this kind of what now seems to be a really old-fashioned process of transmitting a black and white photo hooked into the motel room's telephone and transmitting photos back that way. And I remember the lodge was completely filled with people who were like the linemen for power companies and tree specialists, and it was all people related to the flood and recovery from the flood. It seemed to be in a state of shock that first day or two after the flood, but even when I talked to them a little bit longer, I think just about everybody decided they were going to build back, and that if there's any way possible anyway, they were going to build back. They just couldn't seem to envision life being lived anywhere else in the town they were in. And I was really kind of surprised and struck by how much they were attached to the place they lived and how much they wanted to see it come back. And I was also impressed by the work the National Guard did in flood recovery at that time. It kind of caught my attention, and they really helped people and did it fast.
Okay, so yeah, that was a major flood. We haven't really seen it in a long time. Killed 47 people here in the state, mostly in Grand and Pendleton counties, you saw in the video. So then we moved forward now to 2016, and we had a kind of a similar magnitude type of flood where it killed 23 people, but this time it was down in the Greenbrier Valley. So folks down in Greenbrier County, Nicholas County, the town of Richwood was really badly impacted. But up to 10 inches of rain fell in the Greenbrier Valley over a short period of time. And it was due to what we call training storms. So one line of thunderstorms would come through, and then just another short, narrow band of thunderstorm would follow that. We kind of compare that to trains, or train cars on the train tracks. That's why they call it training. So just kind of a little isolated band that went from about Point Pleasant through Clendenin, there in Kanawha County, all the way down into Lewisburg and White Sulphur Springs. And this was just an unbelievable type of flood. You probably heard them talk about a 1,000-year flood. Well, let me just kind of briefly explain what they mean by a 1,000-year flood. They don't really mean that it's one of those types of floods that occurs every 1,000 years. They really mean that there's like a 0.1% chance of it happening, a very slim, small chance of it happening. So there would be another chance of something like that happening, although it'd be really small. But nevertheless, that type of flood happened. You might have even seen that particular picture over there on the right. Remember the house that was on fire that was floating down the river? Because there were a lot of gas lines that broke and they were ignited. But it was just, again, one of these unbelievable types of storms that occurred. Yes?
Were there 6 of those storms that went through? I either read that or heard.
Well, there were probably more. There was like probably 3 major bands, but there were just a lot of them. I would say within a 24-hour period. Within a 24-hour period, you had about 10 inches of rain. Probably if you were to really isolate it, it was over a shorter period than that, where that 10 inches of rain fell. And of course, they used Doppler radar to estimate that. And it's just really amazing how narrow of a band it was. I mean, if you went to Charleston itself, it was just kind of light, more moderate rain. But if you just went about 20 miles to the north, there toward Clinton, they had 6 inches. So it kind of shows you how small and isolated these thunderstorms can really be. So, and even here in Huntington, we really didn't have much at all. So, let me show you. This isn't very long. This is from the Weather Channel. And they kind of Hollywood it up in a sense, kind of make things a little bit more exciting.
Thunderstorms that bring torrential rain. Something we call training kind of cause a devastating flood in West Virginia.
You never want to see these thunderstorms training. You can think of it as almost a train track with these storms moving along the same area.
Thunderstorms pop up and dump rain over the same area hour after hour after hour.
We had several rounds of rain, and not just rain, but really heavy rain.
In just a few hours, 10 inches of rain saturated the ground and ran off into hundreds of creeks and rivers.
We're talking about the Appalachians here, and when you have rain in that type of terrain, the elevation or the steepness of some of the hills adds to how quickly that water runs off. You get these torrents, these just raging rivers coming down the hillsides.
That's going to work its way down to those river valleys. So that flash flooding can happen in just a few moments.
And that's why we saw such devastating flooding, because of the volume of rain and because of the terrain.
And unfortunately, a lot of times, these people don't have the ability to react in time.
They've washed out the bridges, they've washed out the roads, washed away people too.
It was a perfect example of what can happen in nature when Mother Nature truly flexes her muscles. It's terrifying. Some of the worst damage is in White Sulphur Springs, where Susan Ayers was trapped in her home by the flood.
It was raining buckets of water, and it was lightning and thundering really, really bad. There was houses going down the road.
We have flowing water, water so strong it is ripping homes off their foundations and pushing them downstream.
Gas lines and propane tanks connected to these homes are severed.
And then boom, you have house fires.
In one surreal moment, a house fully engulfed in flames is floating down the river.
The house was on fire. That was our main concern. The fire and the natural gas. It was burning our eyes.
It's crazy enough to see a house swept away by floodwaters, but that must have been an apocalyptic scene for people there to witness.
It was pretty frightening when you see fire and gas and you knew your home could actually blow up.
More than 1,200 houses were damaged or destroyed, including Ayers' home.
Now it's all gone. So I have to start over.
But she was one of the lucky ones. 23 people died, making it one of the worst flash flood events in West Virginia history.
Okay, so yes, that was one of the deadliest floods in West Virginia history, and as you saw in the video, whenever you have most of your people living in these narrow valleys, and if you look at also at the soil types that just really allow that water to rapidly run off, it makes the people very vulnerable. So, and there really was no warning whatsoever. Whenever you have these flash flooding events, you might have 15, 20 minutes at the very most. It's almost like a tornado in a sense. Whenever you have these really intense rainfall events, they send out a warning. You've got to make a decision to get out of the way. You really do have to act quickly. So So flash flooding events are really a lot more dangerous than these widespread types of floods like we have on the Ohio River. You have warning for those. I mean, it slowly rises. But these flash flood events are really problematic and deadly. Well, let me change this over now. And I want to show you some top 10 lists here to kind of put things in perspective. You probably heard this past year, 2018, was an extremely wet year. But just how wet was it? It was actually the second wettest that we had in recorded history. So that goes back to the 1890s. The wettest year actually was 2011, where we had about 62.44 inches of rain. Now, normally we receive about 45 or so inches per year, normally. But yeah, last year we were way above normal, about 60 plus inches of rain last year. You all know it's extremely rainy. Charleston and I think Beckley broke their records last year. But if you stop and take a look at this top 10 chart, we have 2011, 2018, 2003, 2004. So we have 4 years in the 2000s that made the top 10. So we have had some very rainy, wet years here in the last this past decade or two. Now, let me show you the other end of the spectrum, the driest years. The driest year happened to be 1930, 21.73, so extremely below normal there. If you look at this top 10 list, only 1 year in the 2000s made the top 10 driest years. It was 2007, where we only have 33.8 inches. But most of the dry years, as you can kind of see from this, occurred back in the 1930s and a few also back in the 1960s. So the 30s and the 60s tended to be our driest decades here in the Huntington area. So, but that just kind of puts things in perspective, just how variable our rainfall can be from year to year. So the driest was 21.73, and our wettest was over 62 inches. But normally we're somewhere in the neighborhood of about 45 inches. All right, well now let's change gears and talk a little bit about snow. I mean, I know when I talk with students, they love talking about snow. They love big snowstorms. They love talking about it. Well, I've kind of narrowed it down to the 3 big ones, at least of the 1900s there. 1950 Great Appalachian Snowstorm, the 1993 March Superstorm, and the 96, we'll sometimes call it the Blizzard of 96 or the January snowstorm there. But the 1950 Great Appalachian Snowstorm truly was the storm of the century, the storm of the 1900s. It was a November storm or blizzard that occurred around Thanksgiving time. And it wasn't just a single day event, it kind of prolonged over about 4 days. But Parkersburg had about 34.4 inches of snow from that. Pickens, which is up in Randolph County, up in the mountains there, they had the record of 57 inches there. And then here in Huntington, we had almost 21 inches of snow from that. But West Virginia as a whole was just this nail with all kinds of snow from that storm. And even our neighboring states, going over into Ohio and parts of Kentucky. I'll show you a clip on the next slide. And if for those of you who like football, and I told a few of you, Ohio State is where I went to school, the famous Ohio State and Michigan football game was actually played in the middle of that snowstorm. and believe it or not, Michigan won the game without even making a first down. So it was just unbelievable. Well, they weren't even playing on. They were just quick kicking the ball back and forth. They didn't want to play off. They wanted to play defense.
What was the score?
I think 9-3. 9-3, Michigan. That was a high-scoring event, wasn't it?
Yep.
Where's the sound there coming up? Oh, let me get this going for you. Let me start again.
Weather history, the Thanksgiving Day blizzard of 1950 hit between November 24th and 27th. This great Appalachian storm was a large extratropical cyclone that moved through the eastern United States, causing significant winds, heavy rains east of the Appalachians, and blizzard conditions along the western slopes. Its lowest pressure dropped to 978 millibars. All-time record lows for November were set in numerous cities across the South. Nearly the entire state of Ohio was blanketed with over a foot of snow, with drifts up to 25 feet. This storm became one of the state's worst blizzards. Despite the high winds and snow, the annual football game between Michigan and Ohio State went on a schedule in Columbus and was nicknamed the Snow Bowl. Close to 3 feet fell in Parkersburg, West Virginia, and in western Pennsylvania, where tanks were used to move it out. On Mount Washington, New Hampshire, winds peaked at 160 miles per hour. Coastal flooding breached the levees at LaGuardia Airport in New York, flooding the runways. There was river flooding in Cincinnati and Pittsburgh when a warm spell hit the following week. Overall, power was cut to more than 1 million customers. It impacted 22 states, killed 353, and caused almost $70 million in damage at the time. I'm Mark Mancuso.
So, yeah, that was definitely the storm of the century there. It was a doozy of a storm. Now, one that I personally remember quite well was the 1993 March Superstorm. That winter really was really not that bad. December, January, February, it was quite mild. And then all of a sudden March came along. We had a mid-March blizzard. And weather forecasting was really starting to improve by the time we got to the 90s. You were able to really start to see 5-day forecasts and how they were able to really improve and be pretty accurate. In fact, you could actually see this storm about 5 days in advance brewing, and it originated down in the Gulf of Mexico. And as that low pressure came from the Gulf of Mexico, went toward Washington, D.C., and we happened to be on the western side of that where all that cold air was placed. And we got all kinds of snow from that, whereas the folks down in Florida where the warm air was located, they had to deal with tornadoes from it. But yeah, it was just all kinds of snow from Alabama all the way up toward Maine. And you could just put a bullseye right over West Virginia. We had at least 2 feet of snow over the entire state, whereas many places had a lot more than that. And our single-day record actually still stands from this particular storm there. Snowshoe, 44 inches from that. Huntington, we had 23 inches. Parkersburg, 21, and Charleston, almost 20 inches there. And like I said, it pretty much occurred in about a 1 to 2 day span. So it was definitely one for the record. So what I really remember then too is that the next week, being March, it warmed up, and then we had a flood after that. So this clip I'm going to show you, and I'll probably just fast forward through some of it. This is from the Weather Channel, and you'll see how the graphics are kind of crude by today's standards. If we can get this going again.
Severe weather outbreak across the state of Florida.
But we're going to show you Florida where all those tornadoes were.
Florida. This is damage that we have seen from the West Palm Beach area, creating major problems with tornadoes and severe thunderstorms with damaging winds across the Sunshine State. Neighboring state of Georgia, it was a different story. It was snow, blizzard conditions, 50-plus mile-an-hour winds.
You can imagine
many
the way
folks still without power, and it caused tremendous problems as far as traveling is concerned. In fact, traveling is discouraged through the rest of tonight and early tomorrow because of snow-packed roads that continue in Georgia. Farther up to the north a little bit in Chattanooga, Tennessee, the problem continues to be snow and blowing snow. Most of the heavy snow is over with. 21 inches of snow lie on the ground right now, breaking the old record of a foot for a 24-hour period in Chattanooga. And it looks like the snow will be tapering off. The drifts have been reported on up to about 5 to 6 feet. Meanwhile, as we head on up to Roanoke, Virginia, the story is one of shoveling the snow. Maybe a little premature there. Please be careful if you're out shoveling snow. The weight of that snow and all that exercise, those that are weak of heart could have some problems. The problem around Roanoke, as it has been in many locations, is the strong winds accompanying the heavy wet snow, creating some major problems with downed power lines, trees, and even power poles in some cases. Meanwhile, as we head on up the coast to New Jersey, the problem has been the strong winds. Another storm lashing out with beach erosion and coastal flooding, spreading the sea waters deep in interior sections. And again, the winds up to 71 miles an hour reported as far north as New York City. And as As we check out New York City, they're reporting in the Big Apple some more snow. Another storm lashing out at New York City, packing some winds. Wind speed similar to that of the major storm they had in the middle of December, and also the snow continuing to paralyze the city. We're talking about a foot of snow with more on the way before it's all said and done. Look at the storm system in the developing stages, and we'd be talking about some very heavy snows that are
West Virginia is like right in the bullseye of that heavy snow.
We're talking well over a foot, and that's created some major problems across that area.
Entire state.
Again, paralyzing much of the region from Atlanta all the way up to Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and even New York City. Boston area reported some snow thunderstorms with heavy snow accumulations during the course of the afternoon. Let's zero in on this storm and talk about the extreme low pressure. In fact, this storm has the characteristics of almost like a wintertime hurricane, very deep low pressure as well as some very strong...
Yeah, this is what I always tell my students. If you want to see a heavy snowstorm here in our area, you want the low pressure to always track to our south and east, because that puts us where the cold air is going to be in place. So our heaviest snowfall events, you'll see that low pressure in Virginia and North Carolina going up the East Coast like that. This past winter, a lot of the lows were going to our north, going up toward Indiana and Ohio there, which placed us, you guess it, on the warm side, which is why we saw mostly rain. So that's why. So it's all about low pressure tracking. Yes?
How much precipitation is in a foot of snow?
Yeah, that's a great, it varies. Now the average is about 10 to 1. So about 10 inches of snow equals about 1 inch of rain. That's kind of your ballpark average. But whenever you have dry snow like you have out west, you might see 15 or 20 to 1 out there. Now, if you happen to have a wet snow event, you might see 7 or 8 inches to 1. Now, if you think back to 2012, when the remnants of Hurricane Sandy went up the East Coast, and the eastern part of West Virginia had a lot of heavy wet snow from that, yeah, like Summersville, and going up over toward Elkins and that area again, they got heavy wet snow from the remnants of Sandy. And that snowfall ratio was about 7 to 1. And you saw roof collapses because it's so heavy and wet. Yeah.
In this vein, why is it that it seems like, and this is probably more folk tale, but that here in Huntington we tend to have an arc or something where we don't get the snow. It goes either north of
yeah, right. Yeah, I've heard, you're talking, the folklore about like the bubble or whatever. The lows either go too far north or too far south and just really don't take that right track. It's just kind of, I guess, unlucky or lucky, however you want to put it. If you don't like snow, that's probably a good thing.
There isn't really anything climate-wise or geography-wise about it.
It's just the way.
That's the official state climatologist.
That's right. It's just the way it happens. That's right. Yeah.
I've noticed when there is weather just west of Huntington, how many times it has split. Part goes north, part. Is it something to do with the river?
Yeah, that's what I was.
No, what you're kind of alluding to there, it just has more to do with the just kind of the atmospheric conditions. Sometimes it might be a little drier here, so any type of rain or whatever just kind of fizzles out, and then it's wetter up to the north and south. So where that continues, and it just dries out for whatever reason here. But there's really no factors, not the river or anything else that we're doing here that's really causing that. Not like a big bubble over top of it.
Oh, you burst our bubble.
Yeah, I burst your bubble. Well, if we go just a few years after this, into 1996, we had another big blizzard event that was similar. Although that low came a little bit more from a westerly track. And, oops, go back to it. There we go. This is a January snowstorm event. Beginning part of January, from about the 5th to the 7th. And Huntington, we had about 14 inches from there. Parkersburg, about 11. You had more snow as you went to the east and north. So Charleston had almost 2 feet of snow from this event. And you can see a satellite picture of that particular snowstorm event. And there's the snowfall totals over there on the far right. Of course, the mountains, again, got quite a bit of snow from this event. I want to just briefly show you, this is a, whoops, there we go. Blizzard of 96. I'm just going to show you part of this.
WeatherScope with the latest winter storm update. Good morning, everyone. I'm Bruce Edwards in the Weather Channel Forecast Center. Of course, in the East Coast, we're just past the lunch hour. Right now, we're just starting the lunch hour, and we're continuing to watch the blizzard of 96 as it once again wreaks havoc across the Northeast. Just within the last week, we've had some heavy snows in New England, and here we go again with more heavy snow now moving through a good chunk of Connecticut and Massachusetts. But situated through the entire storm has been Jill Brown in Central Park, New York, just off Central Park, and Jill's with us right now. And Jill, I see a few more bodies moving around there besides your...
Let's see if I can fast. Whoops, went too far there. But I wanted to show you part of that video here where mask, if I can get to it here.
Take care, part with it, backwash effects.
There we go.
Up
This
in
is
the
where
footer
I'm
there,
gonna pause
but
right there. Because this is the map, I think it really illustrates how and where the snow is really heavy. As you can see, all of West Virginia had at least a foot of snow from this. But that dark purple area that you see in the southern part of the state going over the east, that was since Friday, that was over 2 feet of snow. So yeah, this is another big event that was very similar to the March superstorm. But this one, of course, being in January, kind of stuck around a little bit longer. You didn't have the warm temps right after that to quickly melt it there. But again, those were the 3 big snowstorms of the 1900s. You had the 1950, 1993, and 1996. And if we were to really just look at snowfall, oops. There we go. This is the top 10 snowiest seasons in Huntington. The snowiest winter that we had here in Huntington was back in 1977 and 78. A lot of those winters back in the late 70s were notoriously cold. Not only were they snowy, but they were cold. Now 77, 78 really didn't have just one major snowstorm that stood out, but they just kind of added up over the year, and by the time the season was over with, you had 55.7 inches of snow that fell that particular winter, and that is the official record here in Huntington. But yeah, 77 and 78 were extremely cold, and there weren't really that many times during the month of January where it was above freezing. I remember, if you think back to just 2015, where we had that really cold day or night, where it dropped to like 16 below here in Huntington. I mean, it's kind of an unusual type of an event. But back in the 70s, late 70s, we had some really cold temperatures. And when it got cold, it stayed cold. You didn't have these little days that went up to, okay, it was 40 or 50 degrees. When it dropped below freezing, it stayed that way. And whenever you had snow, it stayed on the ground for a few weeks. You didn't see the grass for a while. So yeah, that was 1977, 78. But then, you have 1916 and 70 was another really cold, snowy year, 53.3, but look at these, 92, 93. It was the third snowiest. That was helped by the big March superstorm there. 45.5 inches of snow fell that year. 95, 96 was the fourth snowiest, helped out by the blizzard of 96. But then you take a look at 1993, 94, 43.6. That was another cold year where we didn't really have just one major snow event. It was just an extremely cold January where you had these smaller snow events like 4, 5, 6 inches, and then it added up. And before you know it, you have about 40 inches of snow throughout the entire winter time. But in this top 10 list, you only see one year, 2009, 2010, where we had 40 inches of snow. So we've only had one really nasty winter time, I guess you would say, in the last 20 or so years. Most of the snow is, you look at the 90s, 92, 93, 95, 96, and 93, 94. That was kind of a snowy decade when you stop and look back on it. Yeah.
What's the average?
The average snow that we get here in Huntington is usually anywhere between 12 and 24 inches. That's it. Yeah. Yeah, so about a foot or two. And if you're wondering, this past winter, we are at about 7.3 inches. That's about it. But when I show you the least amount of snow, we don't make the top 10 this year. In fact, the least snowiest season was back in 1931, 32, where we only had 3.4 inches of snow. But 2005 and 06, we only had 3.7. And even 2011, 12, 5.5, and just a couple of years ago, that one was number 10. 2016 and 17, we only had 5.9 inches of snow. So when you look at this top 10 list, it looks like we've had 3 really not so snowy winters, at least in the top 10. Kind of interesting to know. So we haven't really had a lot of major snowy winters of late. So then to kind of finish things off, we'll talk a little bit about wind, the windstorms. Now, I guess we are kind of fortunate, at least here in West Virginia, where we don't really get a lot of major windstorms. Not like places in Oklahoma and Texas and Kansas, where it's nice and flat, and you have just a lot of cold, dry air from the north, and they can interact with that warm, moist air from the south, and you can get all kinds of tornadoes. In fact, the United States will get about 1,000 tornadoes in a season. You just don't hear about a lot of them because they occur in the middle of nowhere, and they don't hurt anybody. And usually they're not too big. But occasionally, some of those tornadoes can be pretty large. And you don't have to look too far, at least here in our vicinity, to see one of those major tornadoes. There was an F5, which is the highest on the list there. 5 is the worst, so it's the strongest wind category. That occurred in Wheelersburg, Ohio, 1968. And it was on the ground for an extended period of time, went toward Gallipolis up there in southeastern Ohio. So I'll talk about that one, and then also the 2012 derecho here. But yeah, the 1968 Ohio F5 tornado is in April, and April is one of the worst months when it comes to tornadoes. And the reason why is because you need contrasting temperatures of air, cold air and warm air. And that's probably one of the worst months when that happens. You still have some areas that are still kind of cold to the north, but yet to the south it's pretty warm. So April 23rd, if you have that kind of situation, still cold air, it's able to interact with that warm air to the south. It was actually part of a bigger outbreak that included 14 tornadoes. Just one of them happened to be an F5 that hit Wheelersburg there. It was a half a mile wide. Half a mile wide. Most tornadoes are nowhere near that wide. The biggest one on record is about 2.5 miles wide. But that was out in Texas, Oklahoma, that area. That particular tornado also was on the ground for 45 miles over to Gallia County, and it was responsible for killing that outbreak of 14 people in Ohio, West Virginia, and Kentucky. It was also responsible for $46 million worth of damage. And again, fortunately, we live in an area where you don't really get a lot of major tornadoes. But it's really, again, for a reason that you may not think. I don't know how many times I've heard that we're safe here in West Virginia. We have mountains and hills. We don't have tornadoes. Well, that's not quite true. That's not quite true. Tornadoes can still form in mountains. It's difficult, but they can happen. It's just difficult because the recipe is hard to get together. You need cold, dry air from the north, warm, moist air from the south, and mountains kind of prevent that from happening. But on those rare occasions, the ingredients come together. Regardless, you're going to get a tornado. And a mountain doesn't stop a tornado. I've seen footage that just mows down a mountain, just like you're clear-cutting a forest. It's just unbelievable. We had an F3 tornado that just went through eastern Kentucky back in 2012, went over into Wayne County. Mountains didn't stop it. And also, believe it or not, one of the deadliest tornadoes here in West Virginia, 1944, Shinston, up in Harrison County near Clarksburg. So again, one of the deadliest tornadoes in American history in West Virginia, of all places. Again, you don't think of West Virginia being a tornado place. But going back to the 1968 outbreak, let's see if we can do this. This is just going to be some still shots here. Well, it should say still shots. There's actually motion. It's actually film. But it doesn't have really any sound. It's just film. But you'll see from the Portsmouth, Wheelersburg area, I think they kind of start showing, yeah, here we go. But But tornado damage can be quite amazing. You'll see places that are just totally destroyed, whereas another place may not even see much damage at all. It's really an interesting phenomenon. So, and there's still research being conducted all the time today. You have storm chasers doing that really to learn more information about them, get data, so that way we can forecast them better and all of that.
I have a question
Yeah,
about, you said that tornado stayed on the ground for 45 miles.
Yes.
That, what is kind of the typical amount
Oh,
of
yeah.
distance
Okay.
that they stay on the ground?
Now, the reason why it stayed on the ground so long was because it was a powerful F5. Most of them do not. Most of them are what we call F0s and F1s that are maybe on the ground less than a mile, if that. And yeah, this is an extreme anomaly. Most of them are nowhere near this powerful or strong. So yeah, most of them, maybe a mile or so at the most.
I lived in Indiana for several years, and there was one
Yeah.
that traveled about the same, about 45 miles
Yeah.
from the Bloomington area
Right.
up to Indianapolis. And I
Yeah.
just remember people talking about how incredible it was that it was on
And
the
it was
ground
probably
that
pretty
far.
strong being,
It
yeah.
was, yeah. I don't think it was an F5, but it was.
It was probably a 3 or 4, I
Yeah.
bet. Yeah, being that, yeah, definitely. Yeah, the one that hit Shinston back in 1944 was estimated to be an F4 at the time. And just to kind of give you some more information, they use what is called the Fujita scale. That is used to estimate the strength or the power of a tornado. What they do is they look at the damage after the fact. You can't physically measure the wind speeds with a tornado. You have to look at what kind of damage was done. How far did it blow this structure, or what kind of damage was done there. And there have been a lot of tests conducted to see how strong the winds would be in order to break out a window or to rip off a roof of a single-family home, that type of thing. So what they do now is they use what is called the enhanced Fujita scale, the EF scale. So they'll say it's an EF0 or an EF1. It's a scale that goes from 0 to 5, 0 being the weakest and 5 being the strongest. So yeah, just again, some pretty incredible damage there in southern Ohio. And Ohio really has had some major tornadoes through history. If you go back to the 1974 outbreak, Xenia, in 1985 up in Niles, it was another one. So Ohio has had some big ones. Yeah, in the back, did you have a question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I never hear about these kind of storms in other parts of the world. Does Europe and...
That's a great question. That's what I talk about in my intro meteorology course a lot of the time. The United States almost has a monopoly on tornadoes. We have about 75% of all reported tornadoes, and it really comes down to geography. All comes down to geography. If you look at North America has two major mountain chains: the Rockies, the Appalachians. These mountains run north to south, don't they? They run north to south. And when they run north to south, that allows cold, dry air from the north to interact with warm, moist air from the south, and they interact right in the middle of North America, right in the middle of Kansas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, those states. So if you go over to Europe, the major mountain range there in Europe are the Alps, right? The Alps run east to west. East to west mountains prevent cold, dry air from interacting with warm, moist air. They block it. You still have them occasionally, but nowhere near. You go over to Asia, major mountain range is the Himalayas. They run east to west. Cold, dry air to the north, warm, moist air to the south. They block it. So North America is the winner when it comes to, or loser, however you put it. The winner or the loser, whatever your perspective is, when it comes to tornado outbreaks.
No.
Yeah.
When they touched down, what factors, because when I lived in Houston,
Yeah.
one sailed over my neighborhood, touched down here, went back up, touched down. Why did they touch down and not?
That's a great question. I wish I knew the answer exactly to that. I'd be a famous meteorologist. But yeah, sometimes they kind of skip like that. It's just, I don't know the exact answer to that. It's just maybe just the right dynamics, the right temperature contrast, whatever is necessary for them to kind of jump and skip. like that. A lot
So it's
of,
not something on the surface, it's not surface temperatures or?
it could be. There might be some surface temperatures to that. There might be some upper level stuff. That's why you have storm chasers again that try to put sensors near these tornadoes to investigate what's going on in the middle, so that way we can learn more about it. Yeah. So, yeah, storm chasers aren't there just to have fun entirely. They're actually trying to learn information about these tornadoes. They're trying to gain info so that way we can forecast it better. Because again, whenever a tornado comes out and you have the warning, you have 10, 15 minutes tops, that's it. That's considered to be a good warning.
We lived down in Colorado,
Yeah.
and coming back from there, driving back in town, going to Kansas, over to our dad, which we were going down, I think it was 36, and in the 60s. And we watched a funnel cloud come down and touch and start rolling, coming right across the field.
Right.
We were on half of it by the time it got across that long.
Well,
But it was something else.
well, one of the advantages there in Kansas and Nebraska, you can see a long way. Unlike around here, you don't really have a lot of clear visibility because we're obstructed by our trees and mountains and so forth. Yeah.
What is a water?
A water spout?
Yeah. Is that the same thing?
It is. A water spout is a small tornado that occurs over the open water. You see a lot of them in the Gulf of Mexico, near Florida. Yeah. But the same types of dynamics are needed to produce those.
Now, do they break up when hitting land? Is that the?
They can actually continue on land. I've seen footage of them hitting the beach, and you get some minor damage. The winds will still be maybe 50, 60 miles per hour, so that's still a considerable amount of wind. Yeah. It may not be like 200 miles per hour, like with some of these big ones, but they're still pretty neat to kind of look at from a distance. Yeah.
When you see a dust devil, what causes that?
Same thing. Any type of circulation like a dust devil, like you see out in the deserts, same type of thing is needed. Usually a lot of heat there at the surface, that causes the rising motion, and then you get what we call wind shear, different wind directions with height that causes the circulation, and that will continue up. You've probably even seen footage of what they call these fire nados or fire tornadoes. Extreme heat from that fire goes up, causes that circulation, and there you have the flames from that, and you have the fire tornado. But really it all comes down to a lot of hot air. Hot air needed at the surface will help that rising motion.
I have a question concerning the tornado in Louisville in 1974.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So what category was that?
There were like over 100 tornadoes in that outbreak. It was a super outbreak. I mean, you had them from Michigan to Ohio, even a few in West Virginia, Louisville, all the way down south. The most famous one in that outbreak was the Xenia, Ohio, the F5 in 74. So Xenia's in southwestern Ohio, just between near Dayton. And but yeah, Louisville might have been near that one. They're just trying to think how that tornado went through, but that would have probably been a strong one then.
Well, I lived there.
Yeah.
I was there that day, and we had no warning because the warning system
Right.
functioned.
Well, and you got 1974. There was radar available, but it was very crude and primitive compared to today's. I wish I don't have a picture of that, but the little blots that you would see on a radar were just so crude, and we really didn't know how to really identify a tornado on the radar back in the early 70s so well.
Well, what is the difference between a funnel cloud and a rectangular?
Okay, so a funnel cloud is a tornado that hasn't touched the ground. You'll usually see that funnel that will drop from the cloud. So when you're seeing more of a rectangular, you're probably seeing the wall cloud. The wall cloud usually precedes the actual funnel cloud and the tornado. So if you see that wall cloud, get ready, something's about ready to happen. So you need to take precautions then when you see that wall cloud. Yeah.
Well, back in the early 50s, my family moved from North Carolina to Bowling Green, Ohio.
Oh, yeah.
And
Okay.
that was the year I was in third grade. And we had an exam that everybody had to pass 3 times in a row. You didn't get out of it by options if you were age of it. Everybody in class had to pass it 3 times in a row. And that, the only question was, how do you know whether to get out of the way of a tornado? You would memorize that you saw a great big spot. You went to the next intersection and you went right or left until you were far enough away it looked like a pencil.
Go away from it, right? Get away. That's right.
And if you saw it writing, then you stayed where you were.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So to kind of finish things, I only have one more to really show you here, and that was the famous 2012 derecho event. And that was the buzzword or the buzz term of the year, the 2012, because many people had not heard of that yet. But actually, it's been an old term in meteorology. It's been used since the late 1800s. It was kind of coined by an old Iowa State professor. But he wanted a term to kind of distinguish a wind event that was straight line as opposed to a rotational tornado. And he came up with derecho. Derecho originates from Spanish for straight ahead. So you have these straight line winds. And that's what we had back in 2012. If you think back to June 29th of that particular year, it was a hot summer overall. But that particular day, we had temperatures hitting 103 here in Huntington. Not only here, but also in Charleston. It was one of the hottest days of the year. And it was hot not only, but throughout the entire Midwest, Ohio, Indiana, going out through Illinois and Kansas. You had temperatures going into the 100 teens. Extremely hot. Well, there was a system that was generating itself back in Iowa early that morning. And by, I'd say about 11 o'clock in the morning, it was close to Chicago. And on a radar image, it didn't really look that impressive. But as the afternoon kind of went along, it got more heat, a lot of hot air, trying to feed that system, and it grew. And it grew to about 250 miles long, and it kind of bowed out. That's why they call it a bow echo, because it looks like a backward C on the radar image. But it started to race eastward at about 80 miles per hour. And it was in probably about western Ohio by about 4 o'clock. And then made its way here to the Huntington area a little after 6 or so, 6:30 or so in the early evening. And it made its way to the East Coast by midnight. So can you imagine going from about Chicago to the East Coast in about a 12-hour span? That was the derecho event, and it just moved at a straight line. The winds were about 78 miles per hour there in Charleston. I remember our instrument on top of Harris Hall there at Marshall, we got about 55. So we kind of missed the brunt of it. The strongest winds were a little bit to our north and east. But yeah, Charleston had 78, back to about 68. But the biggest thing about this were the big power outages throughout the state. 700,000 customers in West Virginia no power. About 2/3 of the state was without power immediately after that event. And again, here in Huntington, we were pretty lucky. We were one of the places that weren't hit as badly. But you went to other parts of the state, and they were without power for an extended period of time. There were places without power for 2 to 3 weeks. And can you imagine being in 100-degree temperature? I mean, it was in the late, probably the high upper 90s into early July, even after this event. I mean, it was a very hot summer. So you were without air conditioning for an extended period of time, that hot summer. And there were people fighting at the gas stations to get gasoline, fighting over generators. I've told people, if you want to see society break down, turn off the electricity. I mean, we are so dependent on electricity now, so dependent. So whenever we are without it, it causes chaos. So I wanted to show you.
So the derecho is not the length. It seemed like there was a big emphasis with
there is.
people.
To officially call it a derecho, it has to be at least 250 miles long, and it has to be straight line. If it's less than 250 miles, they just call it a simple bow echo. Yeah, yeah. But a derecho has to be at least that long. And I wanted to show you on the radar what it really looked like. So I'm going to try to pause this at certain times here on this. So this would be about 10 o'clock Eastern time. And you can see some yellow blobs there at eastern Iowa. And again, the temperatures are starting to get warm by late morning. It doesn't really look that impressive. It just looks like a line of thunderstorms. Keep going with it. So here we go. Gets a little bit more organized. So then we hit Chicago by about 12 noon. Again, still it doesn't look that impressive. Just a little bit of yellow. Some moderate rain at that point. But then as it starts to get more into the heat of the afternoon, take a look. Whoop. There, we blacked out. Here we go. I'm going to replay here. Okay. It goes into Indiana. And watch how that bow starts to grow. And you'll see how it forms. You see that backward C, that bowing? That's the bow echo. And watch it how it races toward the southeast. That's about 4:40 there Eastern time. And then watch it. We're kind of on the edge of it. But look at the central part of that bow is towards Charleston, right through there. Very quickly. And then goes over the mountains, loses some of the daytime heating effect, kind of fizzles out a little bit, then hits the East Coast by about midnight or so. Eastern. Yeah. So about 12 hours time, that thing went from eastern Iowa to Virginia, East Coast there. And we were unfortunate enough to live in the spot where it was kind of peaking in the middle to like late afternoon, the highest temperatures, about 103, and it was really intense and powerful. Again, Huntington, we were kind of more on the tip of that bow where it wasn't quite as strong, but where that major part of the bowing took place, there around Charleston, so they got the brunt of it. And just some major winds from that. Yeah.
I remember that day, but I don't remember any warning that was coming, and no one talked about it.
That's a great point. And here's the reason why. This is a Friday. June 29th, going into a holiday weekend, July 4th. Most people have, I'm not going to look at the weather report on a Friday. They're going home from work, getting ready to go on vacation. But there was the warnings really didn't come about until about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So we had about 2 hours worth of warning. That was about it. I remember looking at that on the radar and out in Columbus, Dayton. It looked bad coming this way, but yeah, you're right. We didn't have extended warning from that. Unfortunately, you don't. You don't. It's kind of like a tornado event. You don't have big, large extended warning with these types of systems. You're lucky if you get an hour or two. Yeah.
This is kind of I just want to know your personal opinion about climate change.
Wow, do you have enough time? That's a whole course. That's a whole course. You have a whole class in that. There are lots of thoughts there as far as what's happening. Is it man-made? Is it mostly natural? Is it a combination of the two? It probably is. Like with a lot of things, I think it's more of a kind of a combination of things. There are man-made things that might be responsible for it. There are some natural things that are responsible for it. We're definitely seeing change, but change has been happening, as you can see, for forever. A lot of people think, well, we don't see snow anymore. That's not quite true. We do get snow. I think the biggest piece that I have seen in my duration that I've been doing this is that we get more variability. Meaning that you see more temperature swings. It gets hot, it gets cold. It gets hot, it gets cold. It doesn't stay one temperature for an extended period of time. It doesn't stay cold for a long period of time. It doesn't really stay hot for an extended period of time either. You get these big swings going one way or the other. Now, what's responsible for that? Great question. It's a really difficult question to answer. I don't think anybody has the absolute answer. If we did, we'd be able to predict things with great accuracy in a long period to the future. Weather forecasting, as you well know, changes a lot over the from day to day. I mean, we do a great job 2 to 3 days out into the future. 5 days, pretty good. 7 days can be a little iffy. Temperature's not so bad. Precipitation, it's not that great. And if you go out 2 weeks into the future, weather modeling is really not that great yet. When you start to look at climate forecasts, that's a totally different ball game. You're not looking at specific temperatures, you're looking at averages. Are you above normal? Are you below normal? Are you just normal? That type of thing. But there's a lot to be interpreted there. If I say that this summer is going to be above normal, you say, well, what does that mean? Unfortunately, I can't do any better than that. I can't say on July 7th it's going to be 92 degrees. You can't do that. But we can look at trends and say, well, the way that the jet stream's kind of lining up, we're probably going to be on the hot side of it. It's going to be warm. It's going to be above normal. That's probably the best that we can do. Same goes for precipitation. The way that the jet stream lines up, we can see that maybe it's going to be a rainy summer, that type of thing. But I can't say that, well, we're going to see 3 inches of rain on June 25th this year. You can't do that. You can't do that.
So what's the summer look like?
You knew that was coming, right? You knew that was coming. Well, right now, it appears actually we're going to be probably on the warmer side of things. But again, whenever you say it's going to be warmer above normal, that doesn't mean that you won't have a cool period in there. You might have a week or two where it's actually on the cooler side of things. When you take a 3-month span, you can probably say, yeah, the better part of it was above normal. Well, just take this past winter for an example. This past winter, you'd probably say, as far as the temperature was concerned, maybe, what would you say, above normal, warmer side? But that 2-week span, I wouldn't have said that. It was pretty cold, downright cold, wasn't it? I mean, it was cold, but it was for 2 weeks. But on the whole, I would say it was actually pretty mild. And it's the same thing happens when you look at these big storms, like 93, for example. Actually, that winter wasn't bad at all. You just had a big major storm in March that made it bad. That was it. 1 week out of the entire 3 months that made things bad. So you have a tendency to remember the bad things. And you kind of forget about some of the not so much. So you don't remember like the 70 degrees and nice so much. You always remember if it was really rainy, or really whatever. So, yeah.
I have a question about the current storm that is going on now that's heading more toward the Great Lakes.
Yes. Okay.
And they're calling that a superstorm, and are we out of that path, or something about wind?
Okay. Yeah. Really, that's been the pattern this whole winter long. We've been seeing low pressure systems move to our north and west all winter. They've been going toward Missouri, Wisconsin, Michigan. When those lows take that track, the cold air is on the northwest side of that, so places like the Dakotas get the blizzards out of it. We're on the south side of it, we'll get the rain. We're going to get some rain out of it come Friday. But before that, we've got nice weather, we've got 70s, and probably by Thursday we'll probably hit 80. But don't get used to it, because Friday it's going to cool down again. It's going to rain. Because that's when the cold front goes through. But that cold front is part of that big system that you're talking about. That's going through the northern part of the country. Yeah.
I have a question that's not related to exactly what we're talking about, but we have the flood wall that was built, after the 37 flood through here. Is that, in your opinion, still something that we're going to need with all the flood controls that have been put into place?
Well, if you even just look back to the 2016 flood, I've said that the folks in Charleston they should have been thankful that a lot of those flood control dams were built, like in Summersville, like in Sutton, because if not, all that 10 inches of rain that fell there, some of that would have been into the New River Basin. And Charleston would have been flooded. So those flood control dams are important. And then again here in Huntington, if we didn't have some of these flood control dams and walls, you'd probably see a lot of severe flooding. So I'm sure it has prevented a lot of damage since they've been built. Yeah.
Haven't they started to put the gates in place a couple of times in recent?
We've had some, yeah. They usually, I'm trying to think what the exact number is, but whenever you start to have a threat of about 50 to 55 feet, I think that's when they start to take action there. So yeah, we've had some just this past year of times when they put in the gates, but thankfully it hasn't really been that severe. You probably have to go back to 1997, March of 97, where we had another pretty significant flood event that might have been pretty nasty if it hadn't been for the flood walls and the dams. But that's, if you go back and look at the records and the numbers, that's probably the most recent high water mark. And again, we've had some in 2017 and 18, but 97 was a pretty bad one.
When did accurate record keeping begin?
Okay, that's a great question. Your official National Weather Service data a lot of times date back to the late, I'd say 1890s. So here in Huntington, it's about 1891. But a lot of your major cities and towns across the country are somewhere in that ballpark. Here in West Virginia, you have Huntington, Charleston, Beckley, and Elkins are your four major stations. Parkersburg, I guess, to the north too. Yeah, that's about it. But you have other stations that have data before that. But they're not what we call those tier 1 stations. The official data that we all look at come from these automated stations at the airports. They're called ASOS stations, so Tri-State has one, Jaeger has one, and they're automatically updated every minute. So, yeah.
So would you be able to look back more than a century and a half to see what weather was like?
You can, but when you start doing that, the data are really limited, and then sometimes then you have to start looking at other methods. If you're like, when you're talking about climate change and you're looking at the 1700s or the 60s, you have to look at things like tree ring analysis or other, types of analysis, not thermometers. So you have to be careful when you start to compare temperatures from the past to temperatures now. The modern records from the 1890s to on to present, that's fine. But if you're going to do a continuous record from the 1700s to today, you got to issue a caveat. You're using two different methods of observation. A tree ring is nowhere near as precise as a thermometer. Sorry, it's nowhere near that. So, so you have to just keep that in mind. So when you're doing those plots, you see margins of error for that. Yeah. But you can do that. You can definitely do that. For example, the 1700s were extremely cold. They're very cold. There were reports, well, you can go like into 1815, like volcanic eruptions. Whenever they emit all that gas and debris into the atmosphere, it cools it down. And so the year 1816 is known as the year without a summer because in 1815 there was a major eruption that occurred. So they had snow reported in Boston in 1815 in July. And a lot of the late 1700s were extremely cold. You see a lot of historical, diaries and so talk about how cold the winters were during the Revolutionary Wars, late 1700s. A lot of that was due to the fact that you had a lot of major volcanic eruptions that took place during that time period. So yeah, you can use different methodologies to construct a temperature record, but again, you have to be careful with what you're doing. Anything else?
Thank you.
You are officially our first presentation in the second year of the existence of our program. So